Now, some of you already know that one of my favorite writers is Brian D. Mclaren. Brian is a former evangelical pastor who specializes in constructive criticism of how the church and Christians have often behaved in ways that could be better, to put it mildly. And he offers great insight and hope about how to lead an authentic spiritual life. Brian is one of those people, whenever I'm reading his stuff or listening to him on a podcast, where I'll find myself saying, "My God, he's saying exactly what I think. I love this guy." Or, "Ouch, he's describing exactly what I've done, how I've messed up. The truth hurts, but I need to hear it." I think that these days, Brian McLaren and people like him serve the same kind of role for you and me and the church as a whole that people like the Apostle Paul did back in the first century. Paul never claimed to be anything more than a teacher, a herald, a messenger who spoke truth even if the truth hurt, and whose job it was to point out to the early Christians that sometimes, and many times, they were blinded to what God made possible by the biases they held. Now, I'm not equating Brian McLaren with the Apostle Paul. It's just that they share that one thing in common. Brian writes and talks a lot about how we're all captive in a significant way to our bias. We all have a point of view, a perspective that's shaped by our life experiences, our upbringing, what we've been taught. It's perfectly natural to have a bias. It's not inherently a problem. If you're a fish and all you've ever known is swimming in the water of your fish bowl, then that is your world. That is your truth. That's your bias. The thing is, we live in a world that's much larger than a fishbowl. We are social creatures, and our families, our community, our country, and our world, well, don't always share the same biases we have. We cannot avoid rubbing elbows and ideas with people. Sometimes it's fairly innocuous. The other day I was walking through town and I saw a man about my age coming up the sidewalk toward me. He was wearing bright pink shorts, like day-glow pink, a lime green sweater, and his white hair was standing straight up about 10 inches from the top of his head. And my initial thought was, is it Halloween already? And then I caught myself and thought, well, I have no clue who this guy is or why he has that look, but who really cares? He's free to appear however he wants. I recognize my bias, though. My bias was, that's not the way a normal person normally dresses. Normal being my normal, my expectations, my bias. Bias becomes a problem when our normal feels threatened. Last month, I went to a Phillies baseball game. They were playing the Mets, and while I was there, two fights broke out between fans who were seated within several yards of me. And I think some of those folks had had a few too many beers, and they'd gotten into verbal altercations, calling each other bad things, you can imagine, based on their allegiance to either the Phillies or the Mets. So things got heated, objects were thrown, and ultimately, people were unwillingly escorted out of the ballpark by security. I happened to be with Tyler Beck, and I looked at him as if to say, "Is this normal?" And Tyler laughed and said, "Welcome to Philadelphia." So the bias you might have based on your identification with something like a team and all that team represents, it can have the potential for getting ugly, the potential for people to get hurt. So bias can be a problem. Brian McLaren says we operate with several kinds of biases, at least 13 distinct types. I won't try to describe all 13 today, but just as an example, there's confirmation bias. You probably heard of this one. Confirmation bias is where we judge new ideas based on the ease with which they fit in with and confirm the only standard that we have: old ideas, old information, and trusted authorities. And as a result, our framing story, our belief system, or our paradigm excludes whatever doesn't fit that. Confirmation bias is when you hear a word like terrorist, and the first thing that might pop into your mind is someone of Middle Eastern descent who is a Muslim. When the truth is, in our country at least, the vast number of terrorist incidents, far and away, are committed by white men who claim to be Christian. So if your bias is that terrorists are Muslim, and if it's confirmed that a terrorist act was in fact committed by a Muslim, you would likely think, well, of course, it's confirmation of what you already believe. But if the perpetrator turns out to be a white Christian, you might think, but should we really call this terrorism? Because it didn't fit your paradigm that a white Christian could ever be categorized as a terrorist. Another kind of bias is complexity bias, which means that our brains prefer a simple falsehood to a complex truth. Suffice it to say, we see a lot of complexity bias in politics. If you repeat a simple lie often enough, people tend to believe it, and one reason is that we prefer things to be more black and white than in shades of gray. Black and white feels more like you have strong convictions, while acknowledging complexity can seem like weakness or being wishy-washy. It can even be seen as lacking in faith. One more type of bias, catastrophe bias. Catastrophe bias happens when we remember big dramatic changes, but we don't notice gradual decline or gradual improvement. Brian gives a good example. When he was younger in the southern United States, whenever he drove through the countryside during the summer, inevitably his car windshield would be splattered with bugs, dead bugs on his windshield. Today, however, when he drives through the South, and he lives in Florida, at the end of a road trip, his windshield is practically clean. Where did all the bugs go? He writes that he initially didn't even notice it happening because it's taken years for the insects to disappear. It was gradual, a slow rolling catastrophe because all those insects feed other wildlife. They're a very important part of the ecosystem. So the bird population has also declined slowly but surely. When he realized that there were a lot fewer bugs, he learned it was linked to, you guessed it, global warming, the climate crisis, which is a major reason why, of course, it's been so horribly difficult to get people and industries and governments to actually do something about this catastrophe. If the climate crisis we're now fully engaged in as a real thing had been a sudden, one-time event, it's fairly safe to say people would have taken far more seriously what climate scientists have been saying for decades. But we didn't take it seriously, in no small part because of our collective catastrophe bias. If there's an antidote to our bias of any kind, it's this. First of all, let's discard the idea that there are simply solutions to every challenge. There may be some things that can be solved, like flipping a switch, and we might really prefer our problems to have straightforward black and white solutions. But to be blunt, that's usually magical thinking. When we're ever faced with a problem to be solved or with a project to take on, the truth is we're very often in a posture of experimentation, of trial and error, and not knowing if what we're doing will truly solve the problem at all, or bring the project to fruition, or make things worse, or simply create other issues we never anticipated. Along with success, however you want to measure that, there will likely be things that could have gone a lot better. Anyone who's raised a child knows exactly what I mean. You usually start out, when that child is just an infant, imagining all the wonderful things that are possible. You may even chart out a course for them. Aside from keeping your child healthy and safe, you think about all that they might accomplish. With my two sons, it was no accident that they were given names that I thought would sound really good if they were ever to become Supreme Court justices, let's say. Just in case things turned out the way I hoped, they would be ready. Or royalty. But then real life intervened. As individuals, our children can take paths we never would have imagined for them. Their personalities, their skills, their interests, and their experiences are all variables that we simply have little control over. And yet, we still love our children just as much. We still want the best for them. If their lives are not turning out exactly like we envisioned, and even if our kids have not conformed to our own bias of how things ought to be, we figure that, well, if they're happy, if they're content, if they're doing what they need and want to do, then that's fine. My role as a parent does not obligate them to meet every one of my needs. And being able to accept that means that I have recognized that my bias of what's right and best might not be for everyone. My bias may need to be recalibrated, challenged, or thrown completely out the window. There are more important things in the world than trying to be right. And I think that's the other antidote to bias, being aware that we're biased in the first place and being willing to rethink and to reimagine what's possible. We now find ourselves in an interesting season as a society and as a church community. And this is true for every church I know of, not just our own. For a lot of people, it's kind of scary, but I don't think it's necessary to be afraid of anything. And operating from a posture of fear is never a good idea anyway. It can lead to very poor decision making. But the COVID pandemic has definitely changed us in ways that we'll be figuring out as we go for some time to come. It's a shift we're making. And I think it would be a fool's errand to claim that we know with absolute certainty what it'll look like to be a church community in the coming years. I actually think that's been true for a long time already. In a lot of ways, our natural bias for the church to be a solid, dependable, unchanging institution, well, that served to lower our awareness and acceptance of the slow but steady shift in our culture away from traditional organized religion. It's a change that's been going on for decades, right under our very noses. It's like the bugs on our windshield that vanished years ago. All the pandemic did was make that cultural shift much more obvious. It's not that churches like ours have ever lost their relevance or their place in the fabric of society. It's not that we don't do important, life-changing work together for the sake of good and in the name of Jesus. It's not that we don't need sacred community and belonging and spiritual nurture. And it's not that we should ever stop serving and loving our neighbors. We need all of that. And I'm convinced people will always need that, whether the present forms of organized religion exist or not. But it's also true that many of the ways we're biased to believe a church should be the church are in need of some serious re-examination. It won't be an overnight process, but we need to be alert to our long-held perspectives and paradigms and assumptions and understand them for what they really are. We need to be able to step back and at a distance see the water that we've been swimming in for so long and recognize it as such and ask ourselves, does that still work? And how will we move forward now? How will we shift? How will we dance with all of the changes that are twirling around us? We need to ask, how will our essential cause of loving and serving others as God loves us look now? We don't love God any less or love our cause any less merely because the world is changing. So we need to change along with it. The question is, how shall we change to best be of loving service to others? What do we keep on doing well? And what can we do that's new and better and more effective and more impactful? How do we keep our bias at bay so that we can more clearly see God's vision for us? I believe it's by trusting in each other and trusting in God's love that knits us together. Because of that love, I can tell you that I am thankful and confident and at peace with whatever's in store for us together. We should all be filled with gratitude that we have leaders in our midst at Salem with the insight and the devotion and the creativity and the willingness to lead us in a time of change, to rethink, reimagine, and allow God's Spirit of love to lead us.